You are listening to the Life in Attleboro podcast, where we interview the city's most interesting people who are making a positive difference in our community. Hey everyone, I'm the host of the Life in Attleboro podcast, Mike Sullivan. I was born in the mid-'80s and consider myself a 90s kid, and let's face it, that's when toys were awesome. I had them all, Ninja Turtles, even G.I. Joe. So that's why I'm super pumped to find out that Attleboro has a pretty strong tie to that iconic action figure. I hope you enjoy episode 12 of the Life in Attleboro podcast. Joining me now is Carlton Legg. He's the former executive director at the Attleboro Area Industrial Museum, which, by the way, is a very cool and great place to go to learn about our city's amazing history. Carlton, thanks so much for joining me. The cool thing about our city's history is that the creator of G.I. Joe has strong ties to our city, at least the head part. We'll get to that. I remember having G.I. Joe figurines when I was a kid back in the 80s and 90s, so I'm pretty pumped to learn more about the man behind this character, a big part of it. So how did G.I. Joe begin, and who is the man who played a big role in getting this iconic character to come to life?
So G.I. Joe was a product of Hasbro Toys over here in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and Hasbro got its name from the Hassenfeld brothers, and they really wanted to create a competitor to Barbie. Now, they knew they couldn't call anything they created a doll because boys wouldn't play with dolls. So they started with this idea, and there were a couple of pretty sharp individuals who worked for Hasbro, and they had met Phil Krakowski. Phil was an Attleboro resident. He went to Attleboro High School. He was a sculptor, and he loved art. And I think, and I'm paraphrasing, the little legacy under his yearbook picture was, who said you couldn't have a little fun when you were doing your work? So that gives you a little idea of who we're dealing with here. Phil went to Rhode Island School of Design. He studied sculpture. And he went there. He lived on Lindsay Street with his parents. They had a dairy farm up on Lindsay Street. They had a couple hired hands that were helping them work the farm. And he was going to RISD and doing his art. But he had to leave school at the end of his junior year because his parents lost their hired hand to work on the farm. So he said, sure, I'll come home. I'll work on the farm. You guys help me. I'll help you. As it turns out, he did not give up his art. So he built his own little studio on the farm. He had a space in the barn, and he was able to do his sculpting, and he was able to basically, he said he wasn't a proponent of drawing things first. He had a very interesting way of doing his work. But back to G.I. Joe. So the gentleman at Hasbro decided they were working on this action figure, and they were right at the end of the 1963-64 season, and they needed to get a prototype over to Japan who would do the plastic making. We weren't as far along as assembly line plastic injection molding here in the States, and the Japanese did it really well. And so they were sending it over there to get it done. And eventually, I guess they learned much better here and were able to do it here. So they didn't like the head of the G.I. Joe. They had used their in-house artists and their designers. And so the two gentlemen went out to visit Phil on the farm, Phil Krakowski. And a little story is that these two men in suits came out to the farm, and they went looking for Phil, and they asked his father, is Phil here? And he goes, oh, you guys must be the men that we hired to muck out the stalls today, huh? And they thought that was ironic and funny. And as it is, they were able to meet with Phil, and they said, we need this in 10 days. And he said, okay, I'll do it. He was done early, and they asked him about his process. How did you do this? They liked what he did. It was a kind of a realistic looking head. And I think the others weren't as realistic looking. And he said, I use my mind's eye. He says, I just use my experience. He says, I take some clay and he says, I start molding it. He said, I put a wire frame underneath it and then I make a cast and be able to cast it. And he says, they say you don't do any pictures, you don't do any drawings, you don't do any take photos or anything. And he says, no, he says, I let my hands tell me how they want to make something.
Wow.
Which I thought was like incredible. This guy's a real artist. So he finished it. They bought it from him for a pretty good sum of $600 in 1964. Again, I'm not sure that equates to, but I would say probably 10 or 15 times that now.
Yeah.
And the rest, as they say, is history. And the film made his $600, and it was the one and only toy manufacturing and toy product that he ever did. That's how Phil made his name with G.I. Joe. But he was an incredible sculptor too. He did full-size busts of different folks. LeMay, who was, I think, the general in charge of the Strategic Air Defense, he did a full-size bust of him. He did a full-size bust of J. Edgar Hoover, which is hidden away somewhere at the FBI. And he had a big following of some pretty impressive people. I was looking at the list today, and it was a Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's wife, when he was the president. She commissioned Phil to make some birthday gifts. And we have some of those replicas in our case dedicated to Phil at the museum. And they're these 12-inch caricatures and replicas of Western motifs. So there would be a cowboy, there was a Native American, and the president was a golfer. So there was a golfer there too.
Wow.
And he made them, and he went to the White House and was there when Lady Bird gave them to the president. And we have a photo of him with the First Lady and fond words that she said about them and about him and how he was, did some pretty great stuff. And he did smaller sculptures, about 6-inch sculptures. So he went from 6 to about 20 inches, okay, and mostly in pewter or in bronze or brass. And he liked whimsy. So he would show the golfer breaking or almost breaking his club. He had one piece he called Golfer's Ritual, where he was going through his bag, and he had another one called Four, where these were all made in the mid-'60s. He did a bust of Lowell Thomas, who was an explorer that was commissioned by the Explorers Club in New York City in '69. It was a life-size bronzed bust of him. He was a good artist, and he wanted people to get a chance to see little statues and sculptures. And he did a Native American series and a Western series that were sold in the Sunday newspaper. They had a magazine section of the newspaper, and on a certain page you could get a set of 6-inch Western motif sculptures in bronze for about $125. We have a set at the museum that were gifted to us by some of our supporters.
So cool. Yeah, if only Mr. Krakowski had taken the percentage. I just saw more than 375 million G.I. Joe figurines have been sold. The action figure accounted for 67% of Hasbro's revenue in its first 2 years. So, yeah.
Oh, and what was very interesting is I read that because of the Vietnam War, it took a downturn, but then had a resurgence, and they went from 12-inch to 6-inch, and they made all these new G.I. Joes I'm dating myself now, but my kids who are in their 40s had these little action figures, and there were about 8 of them, and they came from Hasbro with all the goods.
That's what I had
with them, all their accessories.
Yep.
And Hasbro I'm trying to get into Hasbro in the future to see if they have a back room that has some records that would help me fill in some of the gaps. We don't have a list of the different pieces that Phil did. And one day I got a phone call at the museum from a gentleman who claimed to be John Wayne's son. Now, I don't know if he was or wasn't, but he sounded like he wasn't putting me on. He said, look, he says, do you have a list of everything that Phil Krakowski made? And I said, unfortunately, I don't. He goes, would you know if he made more than one gold belt buckle with my father's picture on it? Because I had a guy who called me the other day and said he had another one. And he says, I thought this was a one-of. And I said, And it's funny, we have a few little tie clips for boleros with John Wayne.
No way.
And they were ones that Phil had done. Phil had a huge following with people from celebrities, people like Jackie Gleason, Bing Crosby, Jack Warner, who was a movie maker, I think. Who else? Arnold Palmer. I guess he had done work for Pope Paul VI, and Richard Cardinal Cushing, who was the Cardinal of Boston. He did work at the Smithsonian, and I guess he did pieces for the Historical Society of Montana, too. And he had exhibits in New York, in Providence, in Springfield, and San Antonio. Just those are what we have. We don't have a real complete history of what he's done. And I've been doing research on it and have not been able to find a lot of details of what he did and how many things. We had a great story is we had a couple come in one day to the museum and said, we noticed that you had a Phil Krakowski exhibit. We'd like to show you something. And they brought these 12-inch horse soldiers done in pewter and sterling silver. And they were a Union and a Confederate soldier, and they were just exquisite. And they said, yeah, we met Phil at a show in Bridgewater, and we bought these. And Phil was very particular about signing his work, usually underneath, and he would put the number of like 13 of 50 or 12 of 24. And they let us take some really neat pictures of their pieces. I hope when they're no longer in vogue with them, they'll remember that we have a collection, because it would be great to see some of his things. He was a character. We have a patron at the museum who was a friend of his. Phil died he was 80, he died in 1997. And this guy worked for the companies that would do the casting of some of his pieces that he made. And he said, I got to know Phil a little bit. He liked fast cars. He said, I like fast cars. He rode a motorcycle. I rode a motorcycle. He said, Phil was a character. Interesting.
Love that. So much cool history in our awesome little city. Carlton Legg, former executive director of the Attleboro Area Industrial Museum. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us.
Hey, my pleasure. Again, when I get something new, I'll let you know.
I really hope you enjoyed our conversation with Carlton Legg, former executive director at the Attleboro Area Industrial Museum. And if you haven't been to the museum, you should really check it out. There are tons of interesting exhibits that cover a big chunk of our city's history. I took my children to some of the STEM events that they had there this summer, and they absolutely loved it, especially the museum exhibits. We really hope you're enjoying the Life in Attleboro podcast. It would mean so much if you hit that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. Also, make sure you're signed up for our email list. That's where you're going to get exclusive benefits, including early access to every new podcast episode, special savings at Attleboro restaurants and businesses, and you'll stay in the know about cool events happening in our great city. Just go to lifeinattleboro.com and you'll see the sign-up display right there on our homepage. And if you know someone who would make a great guest on our podcast, please shoot us an email at lifeinattleboro@gmail.com. That's it for today. Life in Attleboro is a great thing. Support our community, promote positivity, and make a stranger smile. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Life in Attleboro podcast.